The forest floor trembled beneath the rumble of diesel engines. It was April 14th, 1945. The pines of Bavaria stood black against a sky-bruised purple and gray, their branches swaying in the cold wind that carried with it the acrid smell of cordite and burning timber. Somewhere beyond the tree line, artillery shells screamed overhead, their distant detonations muffled by the density of the woods. The war in Europe was collapsing inward, like a dying star, and every man who still wore the uniform of the Third Reich could feel it in his bones. They were no longer soldiers of conquest. They were survivors, clinging to orders that had ceased to matter, waiting for an end they could no longer control. Among them, 60 men of the Waffen-SS trudged through the underbrush, their boots caked in mud, their faces hollow with exhaustion. They had been retreating for weeks, their units fractured, their supply lines severed. The grand visions of Lebensraum and eternal empire had dissolved into the immediate calculus of survival. Find food, avoid capture, stay alive one more day. These were not the same men who had goose-stepped through the streets of Paris or stood victorious on the steppes of Ukraine. They were ghosts of that army, haunted by the knowledge that the world they had fought to create was crumbling into ash. And then, through the trees, they saw him. A single American soldier, alone, his rifle slung across his back at an awkward angle, the barrel visibly cracked near the stock. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply stood there, blocking the narrow trail, his eyes calm and unblinking beneath the rim of his helmet. For a moment, the entire column froze. 60 armed men staring at one unarmed adversary. It was absurd, impossible. And yet, none of them moved. What happened next would become one of the most enigmatic and quietly legendary episodes of the final days of the European theater. A moment that defied every tactical expectation, every doctrine of warfare, every assumption about power and surrender. It was a moment that would haunt the memories of those who witnessed it, not because of violence, but because of its absence. Because in that silent confrontation, something deeper than bullets passed between captor and captive. Something that spoke to the very core of what the war had been about. To understand how one man with a broken rifle could compel 60 elite soldiers to lay down their arms, one must first understand the psychological landscape of Germany in the spring of 1945. The Waffen-SS, once the ideological vanguard of the Nazi regime, had been conditioned to believe in their own superiority, their invincibility, their divine mandate to reshape the world. They had been told that the Allies were weak, decadent, corrupted by democracy and diversity. They had been assured that German discipline, German will, German purity would triumph over the mongrelized forces of the West. But by April, that narrative had shattered. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were hammering at the gates of Berlin. German cities lay in ruins, their populations starving, their infrastructure obliterated. The men of the SS no longer believed in victory. Many no longer believed in anything at all. What they retained was muscle memory, the habit of obedience, the reflex of hierarchy, the ingrained fear of what would happen if they broke formation. They were men caught between two terrors, the fear of surrender and the fear of continuing a fight they had already lost. The American soldier, whose name, according to declassified after-action reports, was Private First Class Eugene Hartwell, though the official record remains frustratingly sparse, understood this intuitively. He had not stumbled upon the SS column by accident. He had been separated from his unit during a skirmish 2 days prior, his M1 Garand damaged when he dove for cover behind a fallen oak. The firing pin had sheared off, rendering the weapon useless as anything more than a club. But Hartwell did not discard it. He kept it slung across his back, its silhouette unmistakable, because he understood something fundamental about the theater of war. Perception is a weapon more potent than steel. When he encountered the SS column, he did not see 60 enemies. He saw 60 exhausted men who wanted the war to be over. He saw the flicker of hesitation in their eyes, the way their hands hovered near their weapons but did not quite grip them. He saw the same fear he had felt countless times before. The fear of making the wrong choice in a moment where there were no good choices left. So, he made a choice for them. Hartwell stepped forward, not aggressively, not theatrically. He simply moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. He raised one hand, palm open, and gestured toward the ground. The gesture was universal, unmistakable. Put them down. The lead SS officer, an Obersturmführer whose decorations hung crooked on a tunic stained with sweat and dirt, stared at the American. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to his sidearm, fingers brushing the leather holster. But he did not draw, because in that instant he saw something in Hartwell's eyes that gave him pause. Not rage, not hatred, not even fear, just certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty that resistance was futile. Behind the officer, the column stirred. Whispers passed from man to man in German. Was Macht er? What is he doing? Some of the soldiers glanced over their shoulders, as if expecting the American to be the vanguard of a larger force concealed in the trees. But there was no one, just the wind, and the distant thunder of artillery, and the lone figure standing in their path. And then slowly, one of the soldiers in the rear of the column let his rifle slip from his shoulder. It fell to the ground with a muted thud, cushioned by pine needles and moss. The sound rippled through the eye. Grouped like a stone cast into still water. Another rifle dropped, then another. The Obersturmführer turned, his face flushing red, his mouth opening to shout an order that never came. Because the men were no longer listening to him. They were listening to something else. To the silent promise that this, at last, was the end. That they could stop running, stop fighting, stop pretending they believed in a cause that had led them into the heart of darkness. Within 2 minutes, 60 weapons lay on the forest floor. 60 men stood with their hands raised or clasped behind their heads, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. Hartwell did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply nodded once and gestured for them to begin walking. And they did. They followed him through the woods, past the skeletal remains of a bombed-out farmhouse, toward the distant sound of American voices and the rumble of Sherman tanks. The official after-action report, filed 3 days later by Hartwell's commanding officer, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It notes that Private Hartwell successfully apprehended 60 enemy combatants without discharging his weapon and recommends him for commendation. It does not mention the broken rifle. It does not explore the psychological dimensions of the encounter. It does not ask the question that haunts every retelling of this story. How? Interviews conducted with some of the captured SS soldiers in the months following the war provide fragments of an answer, though they are tinged with shame and reluctance. One soldier, whose name was redacted in the original transcript, but who identified himself as a member of the 12th SS Panzer Division, described the moment in halting English. We knew the war was finished. We knew if we shot him, more would come. Americans were everywhere, and we were tired. So tired. He looked at us like he understood, like he was giving us permission to stop. Another, interviewed by a French journalist in 1948, was more blunt. The American had no fear. We could see it. And if he was not afraid, then what did that mean for us? That our war was already over, that we were already defeated. The rifle did not matter. What mattered was that he believed and we did not. This was the paradox at the heart of the encounter. The SS had been trained to recognize strength, to defer to authority, to follow the leader who displayed the most certainty. For years, that leader had been the Führer, the embodiment of national will and ideological purity. But by April 1945, Hitler was a raving shell in a bunker, and the certainty he had promised had evaporated. Into that vacuum stepped Eugene Hartwell, a farm boy from Iowa who had never fired a shot in anger, whose weapon was broken, whose only advantage was the willingness to act as if the outcome was already decided. He became, in that moment, the symbolic inversion of everything the SS had been taught to believe. He was not Aryan. He was not disciplined in the Prussian sense. He was not part of a master race. He was simply a man who understood that power, in the end, is nothing more than the collective agreement to recognize it. And when that agreement dissolves, power dissolves with it. Hartwell himself rarely spoke of the incident. In a brief interview conducted for a local newspaper in 1952, he downplayed his role with characteristic modesty. "I just did what seemed right. They looked like they wanted to quit, so I gave them the chance. Nothing brave about it, just common sense." But those who served with him remembered something else. They remembered that Hartwell carried the broken rifle for the rest of the war, refusing to replace it even when offered a functioning weapon. He kept it as a reminder, though of what, he never said. Some speculated it was a talisman, a symbol of the day he had turned weakness into strength through sheer force of will. Others believed it was a rebuke, a silent acknowledgement that the tools of violence were less important than the courage to use them, or not use them, at the right moment. The rifle itself was never recovered. After Hartwell's discharge in late 1945, it disappeared from the historical record. There are rumors that he buried it somewhere in the woods outside his hometown, that he wanted it returned to the earth from which the wood and metal had originally been forged. But these are only stories, fragments of myth clinging to the edges of a verified fact. What is verified is this. On April 14th, 1945, in a forest in Bavaria, one American soldier with a broken rifle convinced 60 members of the Waffen-SS to surrender without firing a single shot. The paradox of that moment, its quiet absurdity, its profound simplicity, captures something essential about the final collapse of the Third Reich. It was not defeated solely by superior firepower or industrial capacity or strategic brilliance, though all of those played their part. It was defeated by the slow, inexorable erosion of belief, by the realization, spreading like a virus through the ranks of men who had once marched with absolute conviction, that the ideology they had served was hollow at its core. The SS soldiers who surrendered that day did not do so because they feared death. They had faced death 1,000 times before. They surrendered because they no longer believed in the cause for which they were supposed to die. And in that moment of clarity, when belief collapsed and survival became the only truth that mattered, they saw in Eugene Hartwell something they had not seen in their own leaders for years: honesty. The simple, unadorned honesty of a man who stood before them without pretense, offering them the dignity of surrender rather than the ignominy of senseless slaughter. In the decades since, the story of the broken rifle has been retold in fragments, a footnote in the vast encyclopedia of the Second World War. It appears in no major documentary. It is mentioned in no blockbuster film. It exists on the margins, preserved in obscure memoirs and regimental histories, in the fading memories of men who are no longer alive to tell it. But its resonance endures, because it speaks to a truth that transcends the specifics of time and place. War is not won solely by those who fight hardest. It is won by those who understand when to fight and when to offer an alternative. Democracy, for all its messy contradictions, carries within it this fundamental insight that power derived from consent is more durable than power imposed by force, that a single unarmed man, acting with clarity and compassion, can achieve what an army cannot. The broken rifle, in the end, was never truly a weapon. It was a symbol of the fragility of belief, the power of perception, and the quiet heroism of those who choose understanding over violence. It was a reminder that even in the darkest forests of history, when the world seems consumed by brutality and despair, there are moments, small, almost invisible moments, when one person can change the course of events simply by refusing to accept the inevitability of bloodshed. Eugene Hartwell returned to Iowa after the war. He farmed the same land his father had farmed, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children. He never spoke of himself as a hero, but in the hearts of 60 men who walked out of those woods on April 14th, 1945, he was something more enduring than a hero. He was the man who gave them permission to survive, the man who showed them that surrender was not weakness, but wisdom, the man with the broken rifle, who proved that the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that chooses not to. And in that choice, however small, however forgotten by history, lies the difference between tyranny and freedom, between ideology and humanity, between war and peace.